Hello. Um, I'm not really going to do a PowerPoint for this discussion on legal issues in libraries. Um, I will talk a little bit about the book, uh, just some of the categories in the book that I think are reasonably important. But I'm going to talk more about um, specific state issues. A lot of legality in libraries the book are talking about issues in the law related to things like copyright, copyright longevities, fair use. Um, as you know, materials in the library are uh, like books are protected from copyright in that they cannot be reutilized um, uh, by another person. In theory, you cannot take an entire book that's in copyright legality and completely copy it from cover to cover. The idea is that you should purchase the book if you're going to have a copy of the book. There are issues in copying entire text, but it's only if the text is no longer in copyright. And you're not going to infringe upon it. There are cases where it can be recopied in its entirety to replace a copy that you cannot get in any other fashion. You could not buy another copy of it. And so if it's not where you're going to keep the original, but you need a copy to have a good copy, a lot of libraries used to copy on acid-free paper, books that were damaged through age on paper. As you know, paper disintegrates over time because paper that was created after the 1800s has compounds in it that are affected by air to create sulfuric acid, a weak sulfuric acid, of course, but nonetheless, that's one of the reasons why paper gets damaged, called the double fold technique we mentioned in the preservation section. There is fair use. In other words, if you are doing research and you need a photocopy of a chapter, you need a photocopy, especially of a journal article. There are restrictions for copying in terms of like professors copying for students. You're supposed to, in theory, get in touch to get copyright permission. There are companies that provide copyright, for example, for media. Swank is one. SWA, Swank, NK. Anyway, you could copy an article for your own personal use. The theory would be a professor would copy the first page of an article to pass out in class. That would be the theory. In reality, most professors will copy the entire article to distribute to the class. There's digital rights copying mentioned in the book, and digital rights media protections for digital, that you don't actually own digital in many cases, that you're leasing digital. There's issues related to IRS and gifts. We should talk about a little bit more, and privacy issues. So let's get started. And I will talk first about, from the book, I will talk about gifts and IRS. In that, a person can give a gift of materials to the library and use that in their taxes, in their personal taxes that they made a donation. However, it is imperative that libraries do not assess a value to a collection under any real restriction, because a library is not a authorized IRS agent or has protection for that. If a person gives a gift of materials to the library can write a letter or even have a form. I used to use forms in which it would say that a gift of books, and on the form it would mark 10 hard copies and 17 paperbacks, as acknowledgement of the gift to the library. You can acknowledge the gift. You cannot assess a value to the gift. In order for a person to utilize the gift as an IRS, usually there's a limit that they can do. But if they want to do beyond that, if they want to assign a value to the book, they have to go to a appraiser, that is an IRS appraiser, essentially. I know of at least one in the area where I live who you would take the book to, who can assign a value to the book and is acceptable by the IRS. So basically, you have to have an appraiser for the book who has qualifications from the IRS so that they can do that. They can assign a value for the item. The library can't do that, but there are individuals who can. And if a person wants to give a donation of a book, then they need to get it appraised by an independent appraiser before they donate it to the library. So that covers kind of like the gift IRS thing that's talked about in the book. Many of the other things they're talking about copyright, which are very important. Digital rights media or digital rights issues and such. But what I really want to talk about are issues that are probably more along the lines of funding from the law for libraries and issues for privacy. Now, what I'm going to talk about are issues related to the state that I'm familiar with, Michigan. But what I'm going to tell you is to look at the laws in your state, whatever is effective in your state. Many of the things I'll talk about are universal. There may be differences in the way they're applied. Academic libraries, for example, they get their money for the library from the institution, school libraries as well, which means that payroll for the employees is going to be handled primarily by the school, not by the unit, but by the school or by the entire organization. The library may be responsible for the number of people they have on the payroll and such, but the actual payroll end of it is going to be handled by the library or by the institution. So some of these things I'm going to talk about are from a public library standpoint rather than an academic standpoint or a school standpoint, because some of these things are across the board. Some of these things I'm going to talk about are laws related to public libraries. Now, as you know, public libraries receive funding in a variety of fashions. Academic, as I said, academic and school libraries tend to get funding from their organizations. In the old days, public libraries were usually sometimes part of the school system, which means that they received money from the schools as well. Where I grew up, it was originally funded by the school. One place where I used to work had originally been funded by the school. But most places, the public library is not part of the school system, but rather an institution by itself. And it receives funding through a variety of fashions that are related to the law. There are libraries that get appropriations. In other words, they're given money for operation from a city or a county organization, which case the director of the library reports this effectively to the city organization that they follow, a city manager, or a mayor, things like that, usually a city manager in many cases. There are libraries that are independent institutions, not what's in my area is referred to as non-governmental, not-for-profit. Meaning we're not a non-profit organization, we're a not-for-profit organization, which means under the law and strictly under the law, we're not a 401c3, which is a nonprofit. Generally speaking, we're an organization that's a not-for-profit and governmental based. This affects some issues related to taxing and various things. Public libraries frequently, if they're not an appropriation, their staff and their funding is all independent. My library that I worked at was not an appropriation; it was a millage. And many libraries do operate under millage systems. What a millage system is, it means that the library goes not through the city or anything, but has an organization that is often sometimes called a district library system in my area, in which what it means is that the library represents multiple groups. In my case, I represented 2 cities and several township areas in the county. Not the entire county, but some of the townships in the county. By getting a millage, that means that the librarian or the library must go to the public and ask for a vote, a ballot question. Mine was every 10 years. They can be anywhere from 5 to 20 years, and some of them are in perpetuity, which means that they have the millage forever. There is a problem with an in perpetuity millage. While it is nice to know that you always have funding, it makes it more difficult to get additional funding when you need additional funding. Also, it means that you're not directly responsible to the populace of your area. If you have to go for a millage every 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, and I would recommend 10, only because not only is it what I use, but also if you do it every 5 years, you're almost going from one voting cycle to another voting cycle. If you go 20 years, you're almost too far in between in order to affect changes if you need them. And 10 years seems to be a reasonably appropriate number. I've seen them anywhere from 5 to 10 to 15 to 20. In my state, you're not allowed to go beyond 20 unless you're attempting an in perpetuity loan or in perpetuity. Strictly speaking, it's usually 5 or 10. What a millage is it's where the library goes to the populace and asks for a vote to affect funding. There are 2 different kinds of millages. There's an operating millage and there is a bond millage. Now, you always need an operating millage, because an operating millage means that you can use the money that you received for any lawful purpose. And a good bond question is going to say for any lawful purpose. Actually, to be honest, when it comes to the bond language, you need to use an attorney to write the language, an attorney that's accustomed to writing languages for votes. In my area, there are libraries that specialize, or attorneys that specialize in libraries, and they've written many documents of this nature for votes. So So effectively, what you do is you write a bond question. The library in my area, and I'm sure many other libraries, are not allowed to say vote yes. The law prevents that. It prevents many things, like you cannot use a computer or a pencil or a phone to try to operate the vote. Actually, to get a committee to say vote yes for the library usually means that you have to have what's called a grassroots committee, a representation of citizens who feel strongly for the library and are going to work for the yes vote. Library staff can work for the yes vote, but they have to do it on their own time. They cannot do it while they're at work. Law prevents library staff from saying vote yes, and it has to be done either on their own time, with their own pencils, with their own computer, and do it in a fashion that is not at all related to work. These grassroots campaigns, and I'm going to show a couple of these in the discussion, a very good one on millages. But that millages is a methodology where you go and ask the population for a vote to operate the library for public libraries. And then there's also one for bond millages. Operating millages tend to pass in my area, and bond millages tend to fail. A bond millage is one where you're saying, whereas an operating millage is anything accessible by law, a bond millage is for something very specific, like building a new library, re-roofing, something where you can say, we need an additional amount of money specifically because we want to build a new building, specifically because we need to roof this building and we don't have the funds to be able to roof the building. And so you do have bond millages. Now, the other issues in law outside of that, which is not actually covered in the book, issues related to funding, in addition to appropriations and millages, you also have an issue of attempting to get alternative fundings through grants. Now let's talk about the law. Usually, when it comes to the law has some very specific things that they relate to libraries. If you look in your documents in the law, one, for example, is an issue of privacy. It's mentioned. Now, privacy is a good ethical issue. You should be private. You should protect the people that use the library from being known by others. Generally speaking, there is an ethics about children. A lot of times when a document is written, and this should be in your circulation, how you handle it in the circulation policies, that that children can use the library and it's not being stated out to others. Parents can have some degree because they're responsible for, oftentimes they're responsible for replacement of materials. In many of the libraries I operate in, there is a children's card that is specifically a child's card, and you don't worry about the funding, and you just merely, they can borrow a book kind of thing. It's like one library I was at, it was called a one book card, which means that they could check out one book at a time. There is restrictions with school libraries, or with public libraries providing information for students. In many ways, we're talking about privacy. We're also talking about privacy of adults for what they borrow. If the police come, generally speaking, you would need to ask for a warrant. You don't provide information to the police about a patron record. This is just an ethics issue, too. Although in some areas, like in my state, it's actually law about the privacy of a patron's record. There is a law written in my state that says that a patron record is private, can only be used for circulation, cannot be used for demographics in the sense of sending out a blanket message to all card holders. Like for example, for a millage or anything else. And the privacy issue is such that a police officer could get a warrant to pull up a record, but to simply give out the record in my state is a $250 fine per person per occurrence, which means that if you were to violate patron records, it's not just $250, it's $250 per record per case situation, or damages, whichever is greater. So you could theoretically be fined. 1,000 people could add up, and the records could add up considerably if you were to be fined at $250 per record. That is written into the documentation in my state laws. Another one is CIPA, Child Internet Protection Act. Under Bill Clinton, there were a number of protections trying to protect children against the internet. The only one that has ever stood up through either the courts or longevity has been what's called CIPA, Children Internet Protection Act. CIPA in the federal level means that children should not get access to a fully accessed computer. It needs to be a crippled computer, essentially, to the internet. You're restricting the things they can get to on the internet. Adults have the right to be able to ask for a computer that gets into the entire internet, anyone over the age of 18. But if you're under 18, then it has to be filtered in some way. In Michigan, there is actually another CIPA. Where I live, there's another CIPA. And the second CIPA says, the first CIPA, the federal one, says that the only restriction they have against you to keep you following CIPA is what's called E-rates, electronic rates, which are phone and internet extra funding that comes from the federal government that they will not give you if you don't follow CIPA. Even though you have to apply for it, you cannot receive it. In my state, in the state of Michigan, there is another CIPA law, and you should check yours as well. My CIPA law says that if you violate CIPA, roughly written the same way as the federal, but if you violate it, there's actually a monetary penalty for not obeying it. They can actually fine you per day that you don't follow it. Of course, with CIPA, if you were to follow it, some libraries use commercial companies that are outside the library to protect the patron, and others, like mine, used an internal one. The difference is the ability to turn it on, to access sites that should be accessed by children. Breast cancer. In my one area, there was a school that named Sexton that was blocked. Because it was internal, we could make modifications. If we made a mistake in the way we designed it, we could fix it immediately because it was internal. Other issues that you should be aware of in the law that are not actually in the book have to do with the legality of libraries, in the sense that, for example, there are library law handbooks. You should take a look at your state, because I know where mine is electronically, but there are different states that have different library law handbooks that are accessible. If you take a look on the web, you can usually find where there is one. Some are updated and some are not. But they're very important to be able to find and use. Trying to think of a couple other issues that we can talk about here. One is related, mentioned, there are organizations in your state often. American Libraries Association does this on a governmental, on a federal level, but there are state associations that often operate as lobbying groups within the state. If you know of your association in your area, they probably hire lobbyists, and as laws change on the state level, these organizations often let librarians know through a variety of means that the law is being changed in some fashion, and it gives usually an opportunity for the librarian to contact their state representatives and say, this law is coming up and we disagree with it, or this law is coming up and it's good, but you're able to let your representatives know about changes in the law related to libraries. And a lot of this information comes from state library organizations utilizing lobbying groups to let you know what is being used. So you can use the state libraries associations to be able to learn information that is occurring in your state that affects libraries. You can use the American Library Association to see what's happening on a national level that affects libraries. In short, the best solution is to determine in your state if there is a library laws handbook that you can utilize to give you information about any laws related to privacy, any laws related to voting, any laws related to a variety of different topics that you may find interesting to get more information on. I am going to provide in my discussion some links to different sites that I used in one lecture that are more of a non-state information. I will, if I find any information in any particular states, I will provide that link as well. I can certainly provide links for my state, but it is good to know these different things. Another factor that you can find that is of use in law is related to safety and security of the building. In many cases, what you need to know is you need to know the right people to talk to in your area that can assist you on different aspects of the law. Very good use is to identify a mentor, a person who has a good handle on issues that can give you advice. Actually, one of the people in my area that I find very useful and a very good friend is one of the people who is actually an attorney, library attorney. I mean, he's a library director who also is an attorney, and he is one of the people who helped develop the library laws handbook in my state. So, many of the topics on laws and related to on the general level you would find in the textbook. But I hope that by talking about laws and handbooks and in the state, I provide a little bit of additional information. I do appreciate this time. Thank you very much.